lot of people have never had money and they don't need money. So we get rejected like that a lot because, you know what? They don't care about that stuff. They don't care about your money. They never had it. They're never going to have it.
When they found Frank Fritz dead on his bathroom floor, nobody expected what was hiding in his garage. A secret collection worth millions. Over 75 vintage motorcycles, including a one-of-a-kind 1947 Indian Chief prototype, worth $250,000. Aerosmith's Lost Tour van, a Star Wars Yoda prototype that George Lucas thought was destroyed. But the biggest shock wasn't his treasures. It was a handwritten journals revealing the dark truth about his final days, why he was really fired from American Pickers, and who was trying to steal his $6 million fortune. Frank Fritz was born in Davenport, Iowa, in 1963, and even as a young boy, he wasn't like the other kids. While most children were out riding bikes or trading baseball cards, Frank was filling his room with rocks, coins, stamps, and even old beer cans. He collected things other kids didn't even notice. His parents, Bill and Susan, thought it was just a harmless habit, but Frank saw something in these forgotten objects, something worth keeping. He once said he used to collect all the staples from school papers. That's how deep it went. He even had a fascination with razor blades, which seemed strange at the time, but it showed early on that he had an eye for things that others overlooked. As he got older, Frank went to Sudlow Intermediate and then Bettendorf High School. That's where he met Mike Wolf. They were in 8th grade when they first clicked, and it didn't take long before they were out on weekends hunting for treasures at garage sales and flea markets. The two boys were drawn to the same kind of things, odd, dusty, forgotten items that had stories to tell. While some teachers thought Frank might go far with traditional education, he chose another path. He didn't see college as the place where he'd learn what mattered most. He believed that real knowledge came from experience, from touching old things, learning their history, and figuring out what made them valuable. After high school, Frank took a job as a fire inspector, covering large parts of Iowa. He stayed in that line of work for nearly 25 years, but collecting never left him. If anything, it grew. As a teenager, he had already started buying motorcycles. He was just 16 when he bought a 1964 Harley-Davidson for over $4,000, a huge amount at the time. His parents were shocked, but Frank didn't see it as just a bike. It was a piece of history. He worked hard at places like Quad City Automatic Sprinkler and Coast to Coast Hardware to pay for his new passion, and eventually he had more than 100 vintage motorcycles. He even built a barn to store them all. Every year, he rode out to the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally in South Dakota and became a familiar face in the biker world long before he ever appeared on TV. What made Frank different wasn't just what he collected. It was how he collected. He had what he called a picker's eye. He could walk into an old barn or attic and see what others missed. He spent years exploring dusty buildings, keeping notes about where to find interesting things, and wonder about the lives of the people who once owned them. He didn't just collect objects, he collected their stories. And this approach turned him from a casual collector into someone who treated every find like a piece of history being rescued from the trash. Even in his job as a fire inspector, Frank's passion for collecting kept growing. While inspecting old buildings, he often stumbled across items that had been left behind. Fire helmets, alarms, vintage gear. These weren't just forgotten tools. They were pieces of the past, and Frank knew how to spot them. His inspections became something more. They were treasure hunts hidden behind safety reports and fire codes. And over time, this unusual combination of jobs, inspector by day, picker by heart, shaped the expert he would become. His work as an inspector sharpened his attention to detail. He learned how to read a building, how to see what others didn't. That same skill helped him later when he walked into antique shops or storage sheds looking for hidden gems. He didn't just guess, he had a system. Years of scanning walls and checking for hazards had trained him to spot what others missed. That edge would later serve him well on American Pickers when he was sifting through mountains of junk for something truly valuable. There was one small moment that changed everything. Frank bought an old item for just $15, something simple, and later sold it for $475. That sale stuck with him. It wasn't just the profit, though that was impressive. It was a realization that his knowledge had value. He had spent years studying these objects, and now it was paying off. That one deal showed him that his passion could become a real business. From then on, he started looking at collecting differently, not just as a hobby, but as a way to build something bigger. In 2002, Frank decided to take the leap. He retired from fire inspection and opened a shop called Frank's Finds in Savannah, Illinois. It was more than a store. It felt like a little museum filled with firefighting gear, antique tools, and items most people have forgotten even existed. The building itself had history. It was an old opera house with bar attached, and walking inside felt like stepping into another time. Some visitors said it smelled musty and looked dark, but to Frank that was part of the charm. This was his world, raw, real, and full of character. Over the years, the shop became a magnet for collectors and curious travelers. People would come just to see the strange and wonderful items on display. Not everyone loved the setup. Some found it hard to navigate, but those who understood what Frank was about saw the value in it. The shop and everything in it became the foundation for his next chapter. When television came calling, Frank was ready. He didn't need to act. He just had to be himself. The guy who saw treasure where others saw trash, and who never stopped believing that every object had a story worth telling. Before American Pickers became a hit on TV, Mike Wolfe was already chasing old treasures with a camera in hand. It was around 2002 when he started filming his adventures. At the same time, his old friend Frank Fritz had just left a stable job as a fire inspector and opened his own antique store in Savannah, Illinois. Frank was happy running his shop, filled with vintage motorcycles, oil cans, and old, to Frank, toys. He wasn't looking to hit the road, but Mike had a vision. He believed their picking trips could be something bigger, and he spent months trying to convince Frank to join him. Frank wasn't sure. He liked the store. It was steady. It was his. But then one day something changed. Frank bought a small badge from a fraternal group for $115. It didn't look like much. Later, he sold it for $1,450. That one moment gave him a rush, a kind of gambler's high, as he called it. That feeling, plus Mike's constant pushing, finally convinced Frank to give a shot. He shut his doors, grabbed his gear, and joined Mike on the road. Those first trips, filmed on the fly, would eventually become the raw material that got the attention of TV producers. When American Pickers premiered in January 20th, everything changed. Frank went from being a quiet shop owner to someone millions of people watched every week. The first episode pulled in more than 3 million viewers, one of the biggest debuts in History Channel's history. Frank, with his beard, stocky build, and calm way of speaking, stood in perfect contrast to Mike's high-energy personality. People loved him for it. In no time, fans were lining up just to see them in person. That October, they visited the California Surf Museum, and a huge crowd gathered outside. Frank looked confused and asked, "What are all these people doing here?" But then he stayed and signed autographs until there were no more to sign. Just 8 months after the show began, one of their episodes hit 5.3 million viewers. Frank had become a star. Their early trips were freewheeling adventures. They drove around in a white Mercedes van, later swapped for a Ford Transit, with no set plan. In September 20th, 11, they rolled through southern Maine and stumbled upon Champion Auto in Arundel. The owner, Mario Burnett, was stunned. He watched the show every week, and now the stars were standing in his yard. Frank bought oil cans, signs, and gas station memorabilia, while Mike zeroed in on motorcycle gear. They spent 5 days exploring the area, completely unscripted, just following leads and meeting people. That was the magic. 2 friends in a van chasing the past. One of the reasons the show worked so well was because Frank and Mike were opposites in the best way. Mike was tall and thin, full of energy and excitement. Frank was shorter and calmer, more methodical. Mike went for old bikes and Volkswagens. Frank hunted toys, oil cans, and motorcycle collectibles. When they picked through Mario's place in Maine, it was obvious. Mike grabbed the motorcycle stuff. Frank grabbed the gas station signs. They fit together like puzzle pieces. Mike once called Frank a dreamer, sensitive, funny, and thoughtful. Fans saw it too, and they loved that odd couple chemistry. Some saw themselves in Frank's careful style. Others related more to Mike's fast pace. That mix made the show relatable. Frank's love for motorcycles started long before the show. As a teenager, he bought a 1964 Harley-Davidson that probably made his parents nervous. It was the first of many. Over the years, he built a collection of about 35 vintage bikes, stored in a barn that felt more like a museum. He had rare Indian motorcycles, including a 1938 four-cylinder model he found in a barn in Philadelphia. There were British bikes too, Vincent, BSA, Triumph. One of his most prized pieces was a Von Dutch XAVW, a 1942 Harley frame powered by a Volkswagen engine and custom painted by Von Dutch himself. Frank had seen it in a magazine decades earlier and was stunned to find it at a yard sale. That bike, like so many in his collection, told a story, and that's what mattered to Frank. In 2013, he decided to share what he knew. He wrote a book called How to Pick Vintage Motorcycles. It wasn't just for experts. He wrote it for anyone who loved bikes or wanted to start collecting. The book was full of tips, stories, and photos from his own finds. He explained how to spot a good deal, how to negotiate, and what to look for in a hidden gem. His style was simple, funny, and clear, just like on TV. For Frank, the book was a way to pass down everything he'd learned over the years. He wanted people to understand the history behind the machines and feel the same thrill he felt when bringing one back to life. Frank's past life as a fire inspector shaped another one of his passions, firehouse memorabilia. After inspecting buildings, for 25 years he had access to places most collectors never see, abandoned firehouses, old stations, outdated equipment. It was all there for someone who knew where to look. He started collecting it all: brass extinguishers, leather helmets, old alarm systems. Even on American pickers, you could see his face light up when they stumbled across something fire-related. It wasn't just a category to him. It was personal. What set Frank apart was how he viewed collecting. He didn't just see objects, he saw stories. Each piece held a memory of a time, a place, or a person. He often spent more time talking to the seller about the item's history than haggling over the price. He especially cared about things that showed how Americans used to live: old tools, forgotten products, strange toys. He treated war memorabilia with deep respect, sometimes donating items to museums if they were tied to fallen soldiers. That was Frank. He believed these stories should be preserved, not locked away. Fritz spent most of his life battling something most people never saw. For more than 36 years, he lived with Crohn's disease, a painful and exhausting condition that made everyday life difficult, especially when filming American pickers. His close friend once said Frank had been dealing with it since he was about 25 or 30 years old. He hid it well, pushing through the pain while millions watched him on TV, never knowing what he was going through. Things improved when he quit drinking and focused on getting sober, but years of stress and illness had already taken a toll. His health kept getting worse, and in the end, it was just too much for his body to handle. When he died at 60, many people didn't realize just how much he had been suffering behind the scenes. Things started spilling into the public eye in 2017. Frank had been driving on the wrong side of the road when the police stopped him. He told them he had been drinking and had taken Xanax, which he said was prescribed for his anxiety. He failed the sobriety test and was charged with operating while intoxicated. Later, he explained that the anxiety came from always being watched, always being judged. He said people followed his every move and that the pressure got to him. He avoided jail time by taking a plea deal, but the damage to his reputation was already done. That moment pulled back the curtain and showed how fame wasn't just wearing him down, it was changing him. His friendship with co-star Mike Wolfe also began to fall apart. By 2021, Frank said they hadn't spoken in 2 years. What really hurt him wasn't a lack of work. It was the silence. He'd had back surgery, and Mike never called. Frank felt like the show had always been lopsided, like Mike was the star, and he was just along for the ride. He even joked it was like being in a band with Steven Tyler. You're never going to be the frontman. When Mike posted a message online about missing Frank wasn't buying it. He called it fake and said someone else probably wrote it. He didn't believe Mike had ever said anything kind about him in real life. Still, after years of tension, they finally saw each other again in May 20th, 23 during Memorial Day weekend. A mutual friend helped make that happen. But the pain didn't stop there. During the pandemic, Frank hurt his back moving something at home. He needed surgery, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Lockdowns, isolation, and a breakup all hit at once. That's when he got hooked on opioids. It started as pain management, but soon it was out of control. Mike Wolf said it was like watching a storm destroy someone. They tried to help, staged an intervention, begged him to get clean. Frank insisted he was fine, but he wasn't. When the show wanted him back, they asked for a clean drug test. He couldn't pass it. That was the final blow to his time on American Pickers. Frank's last episode aired on March 20th, 2020. At first, it seemed like he just needed time off to heal. He even said later that he never left. He just had back surgery, and then COVID hit. But by July 20th, 21, Mike confirmed he wasn't coming back. He posted a message saying he wished Frank the best. But that was it. Behind the scenes, things were different. Frank had undergone serious surgery, 185 stitches, 2 rods in his spine. He said he was ready to return, fully recovered and eager to work again. But the network had other plans. They didn't bring him back, and according to people close to him, that decision crushed him. He felt forgotten, pushed aside. From that point on, his health only got worse. Frank Fritz's life changed on July 14th, 2022. That morning, a friend walked into Frank's Iowa farmhouse and found him lying on the floor. He wasn't moving. He couldn't talk. The friend called 911 right away. He might be seizuring, the friend said. He can't speak to me. Frank, who was 59 at the time, had suffered a major stroke. Doctors rushed him to the hospital, but the damage to his brain was already severe. He lost much of his ability to move and think clearly. After a month in the hospital, he was moved to a nursing home. That was only the beginning of what turned into a long and painful fight for survival. Even when he finally returned home, Frank still needed constant care. His health kept getting worse. There were many emergency calls, including one when he came down with pneumonia and had to go back to the hospital. As the weeks went on, it became clear Frank could no longer make choices about his life or his money. In August 20th, 22, the court stepped in. They appointed his friend Chris Davis to make personal decisions for him. A bank was put in charge of managing his estate, which was worth around $6 million. Court papers made the situation very clear. Frank couldn't take care of himself. He couldn't make sure he had food, shelter, or even basic medical care without help. He was at risk of serious injury or death. But even with help, it wasn't easy. Both the Guardian and the bank came under pressure from the court. Judges reviewed their actions every year to make sure Frank was truly being cared for. And then there was the cost. Frank had made millions during his time on American Pickers, but his savings quickly began to vanish. He was spending around $30,000 a month on medical care. That added up to more than $350,000 a year. His only income at that point was about $60,000 a year from investments. It wasn't nearly enough. Frank needed 24-hour nursing, special equipment, physical therapy, and treatment for other serious conditions like Crohn's disease and COPD. His close friend Jerry Jandro said there were even talks about auctioning off Frank's antiques after his death. "I think he'd do really well with an auction," Jerry said. His fan base would support it. As time passed, Frank's condition got worse. Jerry said visiting him was heartbreaking. One side of Frank's body didn't work at all. He would try to lift his arm, and it would just fall. Jerry recalled even more painful was the fact that Frank knew exactly what was happening to him. He was aware of how far he had fallen. He couldn't talk like he used to, he couldn't move, and he couldn't change any of it. Jerry believed Frank had lost the will to fight. When people get tired, he said, they often lose the will to live. I really think he might have lived longer if he hadn't given up. Then came the final call. On September 30th, 2024, Mike Wolf, Frank's longtime co-star from American Pickers, was told Frank was fading fast. Mike rushed to his side. He stayed for an hour, holding Frank's hand, rubbing his chest, whispering to him. I told him I wasn't mad at him. Mike said, I told him I loved him. Just before Frank took his last breath, Mike gave him one last message. Go find your mom. Just go find her. At 8:50 p.m., Frank passed away. Mike was there. So was Frank's mom and her best friend Annette Overbelander. Annette later said that Mike had never stopped being there for Frank. He was with him at the end, she said. That's how they both wanted it. When Frank Fritz passed away on September 20th, 24, no one expected what would be found behind the doors of his old garage. Hidden from the public for years was something incredible. Over 75 vintage motorcycles. Each one with a story. Each one a piece of history. Some looked like they had just rolled off the factory floor. Others were dusty, rusted, and clearly waiting for a second chance. The oldest bike went all the way back to 1912. A few were even rare prototypes that experts believed had vanished forever. Most people had no idea Frank had been quietly collecting all this. Only a few close friends knew the full extent of what he had stashed away. But once the news got out, collectors and museums around the world lit up. Many said it might be one of the most important motorcycle finds in decades. As people got a closer look, the details became even more jaw-dropping. One bike, a 1922 Ace 4, had been bought for just $45,000 during a memorable episode of American Pickers. Now it was worth nearly $200,000. Another standout was a 1939 Indian 4, nicknamed the Aristocrat, worth over $115,000. There were pre-war Indian Scouts, including a 1928 model with its original paint still intact. Frank also had 3 Harley-Davidson panheads from the 1950s, each in different stages of repair. But the biggest surprise, a one-of-a-kind 1947 Indian Chief prototype. Its design didn't match any other known model, and experts said it could be worth over $250,000. But the bikes weren't the only thing that made this collection so special. Alongside them were handwritten journals, dozens of them, carefully kept over more than 30 years. Frank had written down everything. Where each motorcycle came from, who had owned it before, what parts he had to hunt down. He even wrote about the struggles of bringing certain bikes back to life, the time he spent in the workshop, and the joy he felt when something finally ran again. Sometimes he'd add little personal notes about how a certain ride made him feel or what it reminded him of. These journals turned the collection into more than just machines. They told a story, and for collectors, that made everything even more valuable. By the time the full inventory was done, experts estimated the collection could be worth over $2 million. Some believed it might even climb past $3 million once auction started, especially with Frank's name attached to everything. Auction houses scrambled to get the rights to handle the sale. People knew this wasn't just about buying old bikes. It was about owning a piece of American history, lovingly preserved by a man who truly understood its value. But Frank's love for history didn't stop at motorcycles. Tucked away in the estate was a beat-up old van that, at first glance, didn't look like much. But this wasn't just any van. It was the very same one that Aerosmith used during their early days, driving from show to show when they were still unknown. Frank and Mike Wolf had found it in the woods of Massachusetts in 2018, paid $25,000 for it, and restored it. When the band saw it again in 2019, they were stunned. Joe Perry said it was amazing. Ray DeBino, one of the original members, got emotional remembering those days when they'd all split a few bucks after gas and tolls. That van had carried not just their equipment, but their dreams. Then there were the stranger items. Frank had once bought a massive elephant's head from a taxidermy collector for $9,500. The head later ended up with Jack White from the White Stripes, who traded antiques and cashed to own it, partly because of his famous album Elephant. That purchase stirred up controversy among animal rights groups, but it showed Frank's willingness to collect things that others wouldn't dare touch. He also owned an original Jell-O wagon from the early 1900s, once used to advertise a dessert across small towns. That one ended up in a museum, too. Whether it was music, food, or oddball Americana, Frank had an eye for what mattered. He even ventured into science fiction collectibles. During one episode of American Pickers, he and Mike found 4 early Yoda prototypes from Star Wars. At first glance, they looked like fan art, but a former Lucasfilm artist confirmed they were real. Based on early designs from 1978 and shaped from molds inspired by Albert Einstein, Frank paid a solid price for them, and each one ended up being worth over $6,000. It was proof that his love for collecting wasn't limited to bikes and signs. He knew pop culture had its own kind of power. But just as people were celebrating Frank's legacy, a legal storm broke out. In February 20th, 25, his father, William Bill Fritz, filed a lawsuit. He said the will submitted in 2023 was fake. According to Bill, Frank never signed it. The document left nearly all of Frank's $6 million estate to friends and caregivers. Bill wasn't included. He claimed he was Frank's only real family, his only survivor, and that he deserved everything. The court filing demanded a jury trial to sort all out. The case quickly got more complicated. Frank had suffered a serious stroke in 2022 and was placed under conservatorship soon after. A judge at the time had ruled that Frank wasn't capable of making decisions for himself. That ruling became the centerpiece of Bill's argument. If Frank couldn't care for himself, how could he legally sign a will? On top of that, Bill said he'd been kept away from his son during those final years. He claimed they had once been close, fishing together in St. Thomas, and that he was unfairly pushed aside. Now it's up to the courts to decide what's real and what isn't. As evidence is brought forward, everyone's waiting to see how this chapter of Frank Fritz's story will end. But one thing is already clear. Frank left behind far more than antiques and motorcycles. He left behind a legacy built on passion, memory, and a deep love for the past. Whether in a rusty engine or an old van, he saw stories worth saving. And now the world is finally seeing them.